Welcome to the Agents of Innovation podcast, where we feature conversations with entrepreneurs, philanthropists, and artists. Well, welcome back to the Agents of Innovation podcast. I am your host, Francisco Gonzalez, and I'm back in one of my favorite places in the world, Guatemala City. And I'm here with Fernando Pontaza. He is the co-founder and managing general partner of Invariantes, which is the first venture capital fund in Guatemala, founded in 2015. Fernando, welcome to the Agents of Innovation podcast.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. And I hope this is not a letdown after you had Mike Gibson last week, and I'm following his footsteps. That's a big shoes to fill, but I'll do my best.
Yeah, and actually, just to clarify for the audience, I was here at the Universidad Francisco Marroquin for the last month, where this was actually the fourth time I've taught a course here in Guatemala at UFM. A wonderful place, and a course on entrepreneurship and innovation. I got wind that Michael Gibson and Zach Slayback were going to be in Guatemala with their 1517 fund, and so I invited Michael to speak to my class, and he said, "Yeah, I'll do it." Then I said, well, can I get more students and professors on campus to take advantage of this great opportunity to have Michael here? So we opened it up to more people, and I actually did a conversation where I sat down with Michael and Fernando. You were there for that. That was actually not for the podcast, although I'm trying to get a recording of it. So stay tuned. Maybe we'll be able to promote that in another way. But I did have Michael on my podcast in the very end of 2018. It was episode 51, and another cool thing was the reason I met Michael was because of my friend Zach Slayback. Nice. And Zach, he and I have been friends, 6, 7, 8 years now. The very first episode of this podcast featured Isaac Morehouse, and Isaac's a good friend. He was really somebody who I went to ask him the idea of starting a podcast, what he thought about it. He encouraged me. Some other period later, he introduced me to Zach, unrelated to the podcast, and to have Zach speak at an event that I was looking for a speaker for. And but a couple years later, Zach and I had a podcast interview. I believe it was somewhere like episode 30 something. I can't remember, but it was in the early part of 2018. And then later, he went to work for the 1517 fund and said, "Hey, you should have our co-founder Michael Gibson on. He'd be great." So Michael and I had only met via the podcast, actually over a Skype call or something, or some kind of conference call line. So last week in Guatemala was the first time we met in person. So pretty cool.
Well, a perfect setting for it.
Yeah. So, but in the process of meeting Michael and hearing more about him, I was actually listening to an Audible version of his book, his new book called Paper Belt on Fire, and I was about halfway through it, and I heard this name, Invariantes. He said there was this venture capital fund in Guatemala founded by this guy, Fernando Pontaza, who also was affiliated.
Co-founded
by Fernando Pontaza, who was affiliated with this school in Guatemala for Francisco Marroquin, and I was like, what? So anyway, I'm so glad we get to meet. And so I first learned about you in a book, and we're only a month later after me reading that book, and here I am sitting down with you on the podcast.
Yeah, we joke with Mike that if the book ever turns into a movie, I get to pick who's gonna play me or make the cameo, because I'm a small role in that story. But yeah, I'm it's what a journey from 2015 when we started with the idea of starting a venture capital fund to now hosting them and the whole 1517 fund crew here and meeting you, and it's a non-stop recurring series of events that keep happening, but it all stems back to starting that fund and venture capital in general.
Yeah, and for those who might be listening, and you've heard me now mention the 1517 fund. The 1517 fund was sort of an evolution from the Thiel Fellowship. So Peter Thiel created this fellowship program. Michael Gibson was the vice president of grants, kind of ran the program. They gave $100,000 grants to young people under 20, and I think now it goes up to 22. Mm-hmm. And after Michael and his colleague Danielle were working there for about 5 years with Peter Thiel, they said, it would be great if we could expand this to reach more people. And they came up with the idea of having a venture capital fund that invests in the same kind of demographic, the same young people who are starting companies, maybe skipping college or leaving college to do so, and not letting college get in the way of their entrepreneurial venture. So as they started in 2015, somehow you learned about them. Can you tell me the story of how you learned about them and how you got involved with 1517 Fund and also co-founding Invariantes?
Yeah, sure. And I guess the fellowship that Mike and Daniel ran is Peter Thiel's own critique against the college system. That in the United States, you need to get that piece of paper to save your career and get $200,000-$300,000 in debt to do so. Ironically, in my case, college did give me something that dramatically changed my life, which is the fact that back in 2009 they gave Peter Thiel an honorary doctorate, and that created a bond between the university and Peter Thiel, and I guess
that's UFM.
That's UFM, of course, a rarity in itself, because it's a college anchored on Austrian economic principles, nested here in Guatemala City, which is even rarer now that Latin America is swinging the opposite direction. But thanks to that, when we started having thoughts about starting a venture capital fund with my partner, back then it was Juan de Dios Aguilar, and he still owns and operates a multifamily office investing in multiple asset classes, and I worked at that multifamily office at that time, still do part-time, but we saw a need, a gap that needed to be filled, and that was to people wanted access to the asset class of venture capital. Latin Americans are traditionally in love with fixed income or real estate, and that's about as far as what options they consider to manage their wealth. But as success cases started to manifest themselves, let alone Luis Bonan, who's a Guatemalan, who then, after living here, went to the States, started a couple of companies, but more bigger than before, Duolingo, which now trades publicly. People started to consider the thought, how can I capture the next Luis? How can I do this? And we said, okay, this is maybe we can leverage on our knowledge of investing and the fact that we had already by then, by 2015, invested in some funds, VC funds, and some direct deals, and give people access to the asset class. By the same token, founders were knocking on our door looking for funding, because there was no venture capital fund in the country. There were some venture capitalists, but maybe groups that did it under like a deal club for their friends, etc. Not a venture capital fund per se, where you raise money from limited partners, they make a commitment, and you call upon their capital commitment as you find the deals that you're going to invest in. So through Giancarlo Ibargüen, who was the dean of the whole Universidad Francisco Marroquin for many years, and Helmut Chavez, who ran the business school of Universidad Francisco Marroquin, we got wind of the Thiel Fellowship. Because Helmut was a mentor there, and he said, come and look at what these guys are doing in San Francisco with their program. Maybe we can incorporate some of the best practices and use that to develop Guatemala's own ecosystem. Serendipitously, what ended up happening is that we went to that Thiel summit, and we met Mike and Danielle, and at that precise moment in time, they were letting go of the reins of the Thiel Fellowship and started 1517 Fund to invest in the ecosystem that they had created during those 4 years running the fellowship. Out of those 80 fellows, 36 of them by that time had started companies, and that wasn't even part of the mandate of the fellowship, but it happened organically. And among them were people with the likes of Vitalik Buterin, who created Ethereum, the second largest cryptocurrency in the world. Austin Russell, who was midway through Luminar, which now trades publicly, and Ritesh Arwal, the founder of Oyo Rooms, the Airbnb of India. So they said, we can't invest in them because we're a nonprofit. Let's start a fund. And so they did at the precise moment we met them, and it sparked a concept in our mind that we should do a hybrid model. We should invest in them, not only use and learn from their best practices, but invest in them, half of our portfolio, which in a way, investing in other funds diversifies your risk profile as you are instantly spreading your investment in 30, 40, or now fast forward to our current vintage in about 14 venture capital funds in hundreds of companies. But you can also have deal flow coming from them, or companies that you find yourself in your own pipeline, you can lead towards those funds for their next rounds or when they decide to cross borders and go into the States. And so we did. We ended up investing shortly thereafter on 1517. It was our first ticket. And that's when our journey as venture capitalists started, with that hybrid fund where we invest half of our capital in other funds, half in direct tickets. And that's a long-winded answer to how it all started for us.
Yeah, no, that's a great answer and a great story, and how you guys aligned with 1517 Fund and then invested in them. So it's interesting. So for those listening who may or may not be so educated maybe on the what venture capital is, so first of all, I love how you also use the term ecosystem, because I really do think there is this entrepreneurship ecosystem that venture capital funds feed as well. But it's just the way entrepreneurs work and help each other as well. And maybe how investors come along, right? So entrepreneurs need capital to get started, and some will just bootstrap their companies, some will take loans, some will through the bootstrapping maybe rely on savings, things like that. Maybe they started as a side hustle on top of working for somebody else. But one other thing is also venture capital. I had on my podcast back on episode 96 a man named Michael Eisenberg. Michael is one of the leading venture capitalists in Israel, and he's the general partner for a fund called Aleph, ALEPH. And on the podcast, he actually said the role of venture capital is to provide capital for some of the most ambitious projects out there, stuff that normal financial instruments don't fund. At the same time, it's to help the entrepreneur build a company, build the management, find talent, build a network that helps the entrepreneur, because we're in this iterative game, meaning we fund a lot of companies and the entrepreneur has a singular focus. One of the other things he cited was one of his business partners, Kevin Harvey, who had said that the role of the venture capitalist is to lower the mountains and raise the valleys for the entrepreneur, because it's a hell of a roller coaster to build a company. So how would you describe the role of venture capital and VC funds?
Yeah, I mean, VC funds, we're resource allocators, and sometimes, for example, in the States, maybe capital or access to it is not uncommon. As a matter of fact, in the years of late, with all the quantitative easing and money trying to look for more and more risk to find returns, money sort of became a commodity. But in latitudes like Latin America, it's not so. Part of what venture capitalists do is allocate resources to companies where, according to our criteria, each fund has its own, it's going to be best served, and the likelihood of a company possibly becoming a fund returner, meaning maybe you're going to invest in 30, 35 companies, and one of those has to have enough potential to give you back the entire fund's capital. So you try to use your best judgment, and our job is to only invest in companies that have the possibility to do so. But you also become a friend, psychological support, a source of introductions to potential clients. In our case, being a hybrid fund, we are in contact with a lot of funds, and we make high-touch introductions between founders and other funds that we know might be investing in such a company at that stage, in that geography, in that sector, and end up helping colleague fund managers as well as portfolio companies. And of course, whenever we can, we give strategic advice and also help with specific management decisions and so on. But the one who runs the show is the founder itself. We're just support.
Yeah, so the founders of the companies you're investing in.
Yes,
Yeah.
correct.
So, okay, so this has been really great. What I want to do right now, Fernando, is I want to go back and get to Fernando Pontaza's journey here. And so you're a native Guatemalan,
Yeah,
born and raised in Guatemala City?
born and raised. The only time I've had a chance to live abroad is during 2 years while I was getting my master's degree. And I hope I don't get too much slack from my 15, 17 friends who don't believe in college. But yeah,
Where did you go?
To the Universidad Autónoma de Madrid, who has a business school. And I got a chance to live for about 2 years in Madrid and study there an MBA because I studied systems engineering in college. But thanks to Universidad Francisco Marroquin's inclusion of economic principles and human action and finance, I got the bug and I said, I want to do that instead of systems, but nobody would hire me. They said, well, you're knocking on the doors of a bank. Well, you're a systems guy. We don't need a guy like you. So I was almost forced to get an MBA to try to shift the course of my career. But it ended up being a blessing in disguise because that experience gave me a chance to look at the world from another perspective, like all the way over in Madrid. People think, act, live differently, and I got a chance to work at a bank there, the BBVA bank, at a paid internship, which then, when I came back to Guatemala, opened the doors for me to work at a local bank, and after, was also a great experience. Great people owned and ran that bank, but it was kind of a monotonous day to day, because you have to fit within the structures of the banking world. And right about that time, when I was fed up, a scout talent where I had left my resume about 3 years earlier gave me a call out of the blue that somebody was looking for some guy who liked stocks, and that ended up being Juan de Dios, who's the owner of the family office. Came over and started working at that multifamily office, helping manage the multi-asset portfolio, which then allowed me to zero in between the asset classes into private equity, under that umbrella into venture capital, and then us starting that fund. So that's a little bit of how my journey went.
Well, that's great. Well, this is really great. So let me ask you, go even further back, maybe as a kid or something. What was your first job in life?
I guess midway through college, I started working as a Microsoft software salesman.
Oh,
Yeah,
wow.
that was my first true formal job during college.
Yeah.
Yes, that was it. Yeah.
And what did you learn?
Well, I learned how to sell and how to grow a thick skin and how to take no's most of the time, and also how to articulate a sales pitch. At that time, I guess it was tougher because it wasn't a product that I felt passionate about or that I truly loved, like my fund. But I learned nonetheless, and it turned out to be being useful skills that have served me well across my entire career. Because as a venture capitalist, you have to sell yourself to clients, to other fund managers, and to founders.
Yeah, it's funny. We're all in sales at some point, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you're always having to sell something. Something else you said a little bit earlier in this conversation when you talked about leaving Guatemala for a few years to go to Madrid and to see the world from a different viewpoint. That's why I love travel as well. Is I think it really helps people gain different perspectives. Meet different people. Yeah, see that world, get out of the box. I think it's great to come back home though, right? And then you come back home and you're back and you're reinvesting in your country and trying to help that out. But the other thing, Fernando, is I pulled up here to do the podcast at your office at Invariantes, which is right here in Zone 10 in Guatemala City. We're really close to Plaza Fontebella over here, really close to where I'm living, really close to UFM. So pretty cool location. But you have a lot of amazing quotes, even on the coffee mugs and everything. And right behind us here, we decided to do this here. This is a wonderful quote by Winston Churchill. Courage is what it takes to stand up and speak. courage is also what it takes to sit down and listen. So I thought, well, it's great to sit down and listen to a podcast. And also for those who might be listening on, say, Apple Podcasts or Spotify, we've got my one of my former students here, Luis, who is actually filming this so that it can go up on YouTube. So if you're just listening, check out the Agents of Innovation channel on YouTube as well to do that. But Fernando, I wanted to get back to the importance of a mindset, because I think you're talking about travel, you talked about sales, and all these amazing motivational quotes around your office and even on your coffee mugs. It seems when I see this, I see here's a person and an organization that really gets that mindset. And can you say a little bit about the importance of entrepreneurs building a strong mindset?
Well, I mean, it's a lonely job. You are facing all the odds against you. I mean, depending on who you ask, but let's say out of 10 companies, you probably heard this 1,000 times, but half or more fail, 2 or 3 do okay, and 1 or 2 of them really do well. So, I mean, taking on those odds as a founder, you gotta admire that. I mean, the most likely outcome, it's something that painfully we're living not firsthand, but through the founders of our first fund. As companies now have reached a mature enough point, we're seeing all the companies that are write-offs, that are going to zero, and it's people that you've grown to know and care for throughout those years, and watching them wind down their companies for one reason or another, it's devastating. But having a strong mindset, gives you enough confidence to ignore those odds and push forward nonetheless. And in the end, these young people, creating the new technologies and solutions that may extend our lives, that may change the way we work, the way we live, the way we transport each other, are truly the minority that's driving progress forward. So, thank the founders, but to do that, for sure, you need to have a very strong mindset and to navigate the hours on end of work, sleepless nights, and again, it's lonely, more so if you're a solo founder and you don't have a co-founder with whom you can navigate all these trials and pivots. And
I heard you earlier mention that from your perspective as a venture capital fund, being able to maybe even provide some psychological support for some of the people. They're not just getting financial investments from you, they're getting a lot of advice and tips and some sense of an ecosystem, and that maybe psychological support.
Yeah, it is. It is more than you would imagine. You just a reach out, an email. Again, thinking to our good friends from 1517, Danielle, who's Mike's partner, is extremely good at this. Like she has an acute intuition and like to read into the people's mindset, and just identifying if somebody's going through a rough patch and giving support where it's needed. And it's something that we try to emulate as well.
That's great. So regarding Invariantes here in Guatemala, what kind of people are some of the investors in your fund, and what motivates them to invest?
Good question. In our case, our reason for existing is giving people access to the asset class. Now, you might have large multi-family conglomerates that probably have access to the Sequoias and Cotus or large venture capital funds of the world. But the high net worth individual, somebody that maybe amassed some wealth and again has this buckets where he can allocate money outside of his day-to-day, be it real estate, be it deposits in the bank, be in fixed income, maybe some stocks, and this high net worth individual now wants access, for example, to an alternative asset class like venture capital. The initial tickets are big. Like the typical fund asks for $1 million commitment. You may have that $1 million that's going to be called over the period of 3 to 4 years of the investment period, but then you may not want to allocate that a larger chunk of your savings and wealth into a risky asset class like VC, and that's where we came in. Like our initial ticket for that first fund, for example, was $25,000, and it's grown over time as our fund size has grown. But at that time, it was probably the first experience most Guatemalans ever had into having the opportunity to invest into a venture capital fund.
So was that at that time, was that the minimum that was required
Yes,
to invest 25,000 US dollars?
That's right. Yeah. Ironically, the average ticket ended up being many more times larger than that. Thankfully, some of those people decided to make larger bets on the fund, and now, even though our minimum ticket has grown, it's still below the usual parameters in the business. So it's still a vehicle that this high net worth individual can use to diversify his portfolio and to have exposure to something that can produce potentially higher returns than anything else you can find out there.
Yeah, so can you give us some examples of maybe some of the exciting projects that you have invested in?
Oh yeah. The obvious case is a co-investment that came to us thanks to, once again, our good friends at 1517. I guess our stories are so intertwined that it's impossible not to mention it, but it was Luminar. It was a LiDAR company creating an optic sensor for the driverless cars. It distributes laser into the horizon, and that laser bounces back, and much like a radar, a receptor gets that wavelength, and the shift creates a vision of the world up to about 200 to 300 meters out in real time in 3D, and based on that input, the driverless car navigates. This was again one of the fellows. I think he was a fellow within the Thiel Fellowship, and 1517 funded that company, and in their initial phases, invited us to co-invest. We believed in the vision, and we even had a chance to visit the manufacturing facility and got to see the technology working firsthand, and we decided to back it. Fast forward to a couple of subsequent investment rounds as the company was growing out of a prototype and into commercial relationships with the likes of Volvo, which then became an investor themselves, in Mercedes and Toyota. It ended up going public in the end of 2020. I think it was December 3rd, 2020, where they went public. And that's watching firsthand that journey from 2016 all the way to an IPO in 2020 gave you a sense that it was possible. Like you could be exposed to one of these mythical cases where a company goes from startup to a unicorn, being a company that's valued over $1 billion, to an IPO. And 6 months later, after our holding period was done, we could sell those shares in the public market, and we distributed our entire fund 1.35 times over to our investors. And we still hold some of those shares, because we believe so much in what the company is doing that we think its true value is yet to be unlocked. But that is for sure the most grandiose experience we had with one of our portfolio companies.
Now, where are your investments located? Where do you invest geographically?
Good question. It's a mix between the US and Latin America, and maybe we reserve maybe 5% of the fund to other geographies that we're not so present in, but that the opportunity warrants us to invest. But mainly it's the US and Latin America, and even within Latin America we favor Mexico, which is Latin America's second largest venture capital ecosystem, and one that we are very close to. We are a 2-hour flight away from Mexico City. We always viewed Mexico as Guatemala on steroids. I mean, meaning the culture is similar the business dynamics. We have a strong network there, and we have what ends up being a vetted network of trust on which you can rely when you're doing due diligence on founders or market sizes, etc. So our investments are maybe about 60 to 70% US and the rest in Latin America. Regretfully, we had to shift that percentage into Latin America a little bit to the downside, again, as all these macro political crises have come to manifest themselves in the past few years, and you get crackpot, almost dictators in countries, and you see their currencies devaluate, and to the tune of 25 to 30%, and it gives you pause, because in the end, even though you wanna invest more in Latin America, you still have a fiduciary responsibility to your investors, and you go where the investment is safer and sounder.
Yeah, so a little bit less authoritarian and less a less crazy monetary policy might actually welcome in some more investments. So let's go here to Guatemala now. Can you give us some examples of some of the exciting or interesting projects you're investing in Guatemala?
Yeah. Well, one company that is an early investment and that is still out there and probably about to reach a point of inflection is Osigo. And I'm not going to do, I'm doing a disservice to what they do with what I'm saying, but it's automating the process of insurance claims. And it's all, software is all built and written here in Guatemala, and they are trying to bring that solution not only to the local market, but they cross borders to the Dominican Republic, Mexico, and without getting into the details of a deal that they're working on, it could just be that they are just about that spot where finally they achieve a product market fit that allows them to grow exponentially in other geographies. So that's one that we've been a part of their journey from the get-go, and one that's still alive. Regretfully, in Guatemala, the death rate of the companies that we've invested in is extremely high. Higher than in other geographies, because we mentioned odds against you. In Guatemala, you have even more odds against you becoming a successful founder, from the market not being large enough to test your product here locally, to perhaps even a lack of a deep talent pool. If you're looking for, you're growing exponentially, you're going to have to grow your software code team for, say, you need 10, 20 full stack developers. And I mentioned this on a previous podcast recently, but not wanting to be too repetitive, but there isn't that deep a talent pool, and you perhaps need to outsource some of these components. And when you do that, you become a little bit less agile, and companies where the whole solution is being built in-house have an edge on you. So just to name a few disadvantages that founders face locally.
Yeah, that's interesting. So it took until 2015 for Guatemala to have its first venture capital fund. And but at the same time, we could look at it as Guatemala finally has a venture capital fund. I don't know if there's been any since, but what do you think this says about, what do you think this maybe signals about the current or future state of the Guatemalan economy?
I'm quite optimistic, and I guess you have to be if you are a venture capitalist, because you are betting on the fact that despite what you hear on the news, there's always some young person with incredible talent developing a new solution that's going to drive all of humanity forward. So you turn into an optimist, and I'm an optimist objectively in what's happening in Guatemala and Central America, because you see more and more actors participating in the space. And indeed, there's another fund operating already in Guatemala, a larger fund even than us, trying to intersect Europe and Latin America. There's other good friends operating in El Salvador as well, with their own venture capital funds and efforts, some in Costa Rica as well. And you see the poise and the way founders pitch their startups to you way more polished than how it was back in 2015. So
only 8 years we've seen it.
Yeah,
You've seen a big progress in just the way people are pitching their companies.
Yeah. You see the likes of the Volcano Summit, which is an event that takes place here every September. You should come, by the way, back.
September?
Yes.
All right. We gotta come back in September.
Yeah. Just today I was talking to Jangma, the one of the organizers, and it's an event that brings together like over 1,500 people from all of Latin America. Some great speakers to the likes of the CEO of Hyperloop and people from Singularity University. And you see that once venture capitalists from abroad are here and they see, the landscape, the talent, the type of people that are here, they're willing to take a chance of investing here in the region. So I'm optimistic.
Can you tell me a little bit? So, by the way, great name, Volcano Summit. I think there's like 39 volcanoes or something. 30 volcanoes in Guatemala.
Just I hope my geography teacher.
Yeah,
I'm gonna bet on 30.
I hear a different answer every time I come up with. So there's a lot of volcanoes in Guatemala, especially for how relatively small the country is on the world map. But great name. How did this start? Who started it, and what was the kind of motivation behind it?
Yeah, well, you mentioned Israel, and this is a story best left to the event organizer.
Okay.
But if my memory serves me right, it started with Yossi Bardi, who's an Israeli founder of, if I'm not mistaken, with his son ICQ, that old messaging platform from back in the day.
Yeah.
And he's somewhat considered the godfather of Startup Nation Israel. The first time he hosted an event, a version different than his event called Kinernet in Israel, he called it Kinerlat here in Guatemala, was the first time he ventured out of his own geography to do one such event. Yangma managed that event spectacularly, and then it evolved into the Volcano Summit, which has been ongoing for, I think, since 2018, year after year, except through COVID, when they had it virtually. And it's a really well put together event.
Does it take place Antigua?
In Antigua, yeah.
Very cool. Well, we'll have to come back here in September for the Volcano Summit. I have heard about it from different people, and speaking of Guatemala, we have a lot of people. Hopefully, we'll have a lot of people listening and watching here in Guatemala, and but we also have a U.S. audience here primarily for this podcast. What can you tell them? What can you tell people what it's like living and working in Guatemala City in 2023? Because I say this, I've brought in more than 40 people to Guatemala in the last 2 years through various group trips and different friends that have come, and every single person, I think, of those 40 plus people, only 2 or 3 had actually been to Guatemala at some point. All the rest, it was brand new. And they said, okay, we'll trust you. The pictures look cool. The more people that come, the more people trust me and want to come. And anyway, people get here, though, and they're so shocked. And it's like they're shocked because they think, well, they've been told it's unsafe. They don't really know what to expect. I think also there's just not a travel pattern. Maybe a lot more people go to Mexico or Costa Rica or Europe or whatever. And finally, it's like, oh, they didn't really think about Guatemala. And they come here and they're like, oh, cool, the volcanoes, the Lake Atitlan, Antigua, even Guatemala City. I bring people here first so they can see, look at this big modern city with a lot of great people, a lot of great businesses. So I just wanted to preface that, but I wanted to ask you, what is your sort of perspective of what it's like living and working here that you could tell maybe others that don't?
Yeah, I mean, it's great. I mean, with low cost of living, you get access, like you said, to live in a city that's quite modern, up to par with any other city that I could think of in Latin America, and with great options like restaurants readily available. We had lunch in a great French restaurant across the street. It's and a small homely bistro. A lot of food options. You get perfect weather. It's called the land of the eternal spring. It's like the moniker because it's never too hot, it's never too cold. You are, 2 hours flight away from Miami, Houston, same time differential from the States. You're in the same time zone, that is, sorry. You have coasts on both sides. You can drive an hour and a half and you're in a colonial city, Antigua, where the volcano summit takes place. That was the old capital for the country, and it's a city that remains pretty much how it was in the 1700s, like very colonial Spanish type architecture.
And it was founded in the 1500s.
Yes. A big earthquake in 1773 did a lot of damage, plus then a landslide from one of the volcanoes. It wasn't even an eruption, but a landslide from one large volcano that had accumulated water on the top caused them to leave that city and finally end up here, where the city, where we are at now, is located. But you got that option. You got an hour and change away from that volcano, a lake surrounded by about 7 volcanoes called Lake Atitlan, a picture perfect place. You got a large Mayan city, the largest Mayan city in the north of the country called Petén, and all this within a very, short, small landscape. So I think our tourism institute has to be terrible to not be able to market this and put us on par with, like you said, where people go for other options like Costa Rica or even Mexico. I think you will be well served to come here. It's about as safe as any other Latin American city. You experienced it yourself. And
honestly, let's pause there.
Yeah.
I think it's as safe as almost any American city, U.S. city, point. Because there's definitely places in the United States I would not rather be. I'm not going to name any of them, but you guys know what I'm talking about. There's a lot of dangerous spots in a lot of American cities on any given day, and so one of the things, and the U.S. State Department's going to hate me, but the State Department. They have the way they talk about other countries, including Guatemala, like on their website to warn Americans. I think this is a PR problem for Guatemala, and maybe there are just not the right incentives in place for them to, I don't know what the level is at this moment we're speaking, but when I was here in 2021, I had been here about 6 weeks. I was hanging out on a balcony of a condo building that I was living in. 2 blocks away is a beautiful grocery store, La Estación, Zone 10, right? Like, I live life like I live life anywhere else. And I have friends calling me saying, I went to the State Department's website and it lists Guatemala as a level 4 advisory. I said, what the heck does that mean? And then you start looking at, well, what other places in the world are level 4? And so, again, I think maybe there was a COVID. We weren't quite in 2020, but that might have been why it bumped up to level 4. I don't know if it's like level 3, but this whole thing is absurd to me. And so but that one of the reasons I wanted to ask you what it's like living and working here. We don't have to go deep into all the what people's perception is, but I also want to kind of know like the business environment and just working with other, because we're here at your office and we're right across the street from a beautiful sort of indoor-outdoor mall that could be in Boca Raton, Florida, Plaza Fontebella. And I say Boca Raton for people who know, it's like a nice, beautiful area of Florida, right? Like a nice place where you can shop and dine, and maybe once in a while you'll hear some live music around there. And I can walk from right there 10 minutes over to a house that I've been renting, and it's perfectly fine. Now, should you be walking by yourself at 11 o'clock at night, with maybe something expensive on you? Okay, but probably anywhere else in the world, probably not either. But in a course of a day, there seems to be a lot of active businesses. Zone 10, especially where we're at, is very commercial and business friendly. So I'm just curious what it's like. In that sense, just working here every day. Yeah,
it's the experience you just described. We across the street, go have a perfect lunch. I was just there before coming over to you, and like you said, if you're clever about it, life is pretty agreeable, and again at a very modest cost. I guess maybe part of the bad rep is maybe not looking at the country as a whole. The city is its own particular capsule, which is not representative of the whole rural area of the country or parts of the country where drug dealing narcotraficantes are operating, like Zacapa on those parts in the mid east side, where it is unsafe. And maybe those statistics are the one that drives the ratings, the way the U.S. treats them. But if you conduct yourself in areas like here and others within the city, and Antigua, Guatemala, and Lake Atitlan, you'll be perfectly fine, and life is pretty agreeable. And business-wise, I mean, it's also a country where the government has low intervention, if you will, or inherence in the economy. Debt to GDP, if I'm not mistaken, is about 6%. It's not compared to El Salvador, that's like 89% or something like that.
The government's role in
the role in the economy is minimal. The exchange rate has been steady for decades, and it's luxuries that you can't really find in most any other countries in Latin America. So I would definitely invite you to, or your listeners, to have another look and come down and visit, and we'll gladly host you.
I've got a follow-up here on this. So how can others invest in Guatemala? And when I say that, I'd like you to think about two audiences. How can other Guatemalans invest in Guatemala, and what can they do to empower this country to rise economically? So that's my first part of the question. The second part would be for those outside Guatemala. What ways can outside investors collaborate with you and maybe with the people of Guatemala to help people here, be empowered to help their country develop?
Got it. Well, as far as locals, again, you're seeing the economy and the financial industry mature. You have now even private equity real estate funds operating locally, run by locals, investing in local real estate properties. You have Guatemalan companies issuing Euroclearable bonds in the international markets that pay for the supposed risk premium of the country very decent rates. That's also an option for outside investors that you mentioned, but also for locals. There's a lot of call centers also operating here of high caliber from Telos, that's a publicly traded company from Canada. Textile manufacturing, I recall, is our second largest export. So maybe you can do something within that particular business sector. Tourism. We mentioned all these natural wonders of the volcanoes and Antigua and Atitlan and coasts in both oceans, Pacific and Atlantic. That could be also something that locals can help proliferate. And as far as people from abroad, there's a lot of gaps to be filled in a lot of industries that have been going back to the call centers. I mean, Telos came and realized that most of the countries, at least in the city, and people who operate here are bilingual. There's a heavy cultural influence from the U.S. towards us. So it's basically like you're talking to a fellow countryman, and tourists and people from abroad are received with open arms, and or you can invest in Invariantes. We're still open on our third vintage if anyone's interested.
So anybody like outside the country could invest in Invariantes.
Yeah, it's
and you guys also have. Is it correct to say about half of your investments are in 1517 fund?
No. It's less. It's
okay.
Less. It's about, let's say, out of a $30 million fund, it's about $2 million.
Okay.
The commitment to 1517, and we collaborate in other co-investments with them very proactively. But it's not such a large position that it dominates the nature of our own strategy.
So another question for you here. regarding the entrepreneurship ecosystem here in Guatemala, what's it like? What are the positive things you're seeing? And also where there's still some needs for some room for improvement in that ecosystem.
Got positive things I'm seeing. You have areas like the tech. I don't know if you've been to Zone 4, which is Zone 4. Branding itself. It's a project brought forth by Juan Mini, who's a close friend and ally. That he is creating Silicon Valley with beans, he calls it, but it's a complex of about 4 buildings trying to attract exclusively technology tenants, trying to create those spaces here. Again, this type of thing wasn't here years ago, and it's now existing. So you see that type of stuff. And the second part of your question was,
where's there still some need for room for improvement?
Yeah. The rule of law, perhaps, without the perhaps, needs work. The institutions are somewhat debilitated by the corruption you would expect from any other country in the government sector, and also perhaps influenced in some way or another by all the money flowing from the drug traffic system. So rule of law would be one. For sure, road infrastructure as well could use some work. If you could get from one place to another without having to drive through yet another little town like Antigua, Guatemala. Every time you go there and it's rush hour, it's a nightmare, because it's still unimaginable to me how, being such close to the city and what could potentially be a tourism powerhouse, you should build a road straight to it and have people come to the city, go there. No, you still have to go through a little town, and the traffic forms at 5 o'clock, etc. But infrastructure and roads.
It's so funny you say that, because I got a friend. I don't want to mention his name right here, but I'm going to send this to him. He's actually just left Guatemala today. He got here last week. He came with another friend. I took them to the lake. We get to the lake. They arrived at the airport at like 12:30 on a Friday. We get on a shuttle, we get to the lake, and we get there about 4:30 or so. We grab some food. We're staying in another village, Santa Cruz, and so we take some pictures of the sunset by the lake about 5:30. Beautiful. We get on the boat. It's like the last public boat going to Santa Cruz around 5:30. And my friend looks at me, first time ever in Guatemala. He'd been here like 5 hours. And he looks at me and he says, "Oh my God, I never want to leave." Right? And I said, "Welcome to Guatemala. This is it. You just got here." But with all that said, he loved it. He went to Lake Atilan, he went to Antigua, but I wasn't with them this week in Antigua. They went there on their own because, I had to come back and do some work. But he texted me yesterday. He said, "Man, I love this place, but the one reason I would never move here willingly is the roads." Exactly what you just said. He goes, I want to go from Antigua to Pacaya, and it says it's 15 miles, but it's going to take me an hour and a half. And that's like probably without traffic. And it's kind of what you're saying, like the road infrastructure, and even like getting from here to like Guatemala City to Antigua, how long it could take without traffic, but with traffic, it could be like crazy not to go that far. And you kind of understand some places like the mountain roads, you got to go around mountains and things like that. But it is kind of interesting. And that could be, but the one thing I noticed in Guatemala City, right, at rush hour, oh man, it's crazy. We were just talking about that. Now, I've been one little innovation I've seen around here is these little electric scooters.
Oh yeah, the Bird scooters. Yeah. Bird operates in the U.S. and also here. I come sometimes to work. Just download the app.
Yeah.
You unlock an electric scooter and off you go. And there's a paths that you can link one zone to the other. Because that's how the city.
You got to be very creative on those paths. Because, once I get over to the Reforma, you could go all the way from zone 14 to 13 to 10 to 9 to 4 to 1 pretty easily on those paths. But if I'm over like by the Oakland Mall and I'm trying to get over to the path, those 5 minutes of getting over there, it's like the sidewalks are off and, I got to dart into the street where I'm kind of taking my life into my own hands for about 30 seconds. But if they could just figure out a little bit of that, maybe the sidewalks and the other infrastructure around the country, I think it would be great. by the way, it's funny because it made me think as I was in this country for a while and traveling around. It really did make me think and reflect on, you know, my own experiences growing up in the U.S. Like, wow, I take for granted like great infrastructure, and we even complain about infrastructure in the U.S. All the time, but transportation of not just people but goods, commerce, right? So that would be something, you know. So the rule of law, transportation infrastructure.
Yeah, and I guess just perhaps even some legal innovation. We had to incorporate ourselves abroad because there's no legal figure. I don't know. No legal, no exempted limited partnership, which is the legal form that you have to take if you want to be a VC fund. It's non-existent here. So you
like an LLC,
because it's a version of the LLC, because it has a GP company and a LP company both together form an exempted limited partnership. But you can't incorporate here because it doesn't exist. That's something that Panama has done well, like becoming a financial hub for Latin America, but something that definitely could also needs improvement here. And yeah, like the roads, like you say, it's goods as well as people. So much so that, I mean, supposedly they're gonna build this new road here or there, and then midway through it's a scandal because the government stole away like a large chunk of the, or they hired a corrupt other company to execute the works, or the road fell apart years later. So much so that now it's a private road called the VAS. I don't know if you've heard about that one, but it's linking hubs and hubs in a private highway, because somebody saw the need, and God bless them. I hope they succeed, and maybe that's the way we're gonna get to go from point A to point B without driving through insane traffic through a privately owned system of highways.
Yeah, and the other aspect of the traffic is, you know, I was looking into this, and in the last 10 to 20 years, the amount of people that can actually afford and own vehicles has gone up dramatically. So in some sense, it's a symptom of progress that you have so many more people on the roads with their own vehicles that you didn't 10 or 20 years ago. And actually I was looking at, it's almost, even if your infrastructure was like trying to keep up, it's very difficult to keep up with that amount of progress. You should study the state of Florida, because somehow we went from like 1 million people in 1945 to about 22 million just 60, 70 years later. In one state, and the infrastructure, I don't know, somehow was kept up.
Yeah. Also, lack of public transportation. I mean, if you are somebody living in like a part of the city where it's not easily accessible by public transportation, which is almost non-existent, or you risk having a bad experience. Most people have to buy a car, import a crash card from the States, fix it up here, or own a motorcycle and move that way, and that creates traffic, right? That could be another thing to work on, like public transportation. You know, my solution is I sold my car and I only ride a motorcycle.
Oh yeah. But how does that work in the rain?
Those days I debate whether I take an Uber and go through traffic, or just wear a raincoat and wet my shoes and get there quickly.
In the year or so I lived here, I don't own a car. I've never driven a car. I either take Uber, scooters, walk, whatever. So I think it's a possibility. Okay, I got two last questions for you. One's a fun one, and I think this is one I asked some of our mutual friends what I should ask you about, and I thought it would be something business, but they said Fernando is a man of great taste, in wine, and watches. So what has made you passionate about some of these things, Fernando?
Who was this, Mike or what? Oh my God.
I'm not gonna say.
I don't know. I started meditating a while back, not too long ago, but I guess just the experience of being present helped me. I gained a sense of appreciation towards when I have a meal. It's not just something that's there that I should gobble down, but somebody, and maybe it's even the influence of my French friends from the bistro that we went to eat, because they take that thing seriously. But somebody, you know, put a lot of effort into doing this. Somebody spent years trying to create this wine to cared for the grapes, brought it through barrels of wood or concrete, whatever method they desire, all to present to you this achievement, same as a watch, which could also be an investment in this inflationary times. But the respect for the craft and into the final product, I think it's more than just a snobby or materialistic thing that you could pursue, but just respecting somebody doing something with such passion that they try to put their best effort there, and you appreciating it presently in the experience.
That's great. By the way, speaking of watches, I had a vintage watch dealer on this podcast somewhere in the episode 73 range or something, but that was my friend Eric Wind Vintage. He is like now one of the well-known vintage watch dealers. And by the way, I knew Eric when he was in college and was a political science major. So if I ever thought he was going to be a vintage watch dealer and does very well in this category, he's even been in documentary. So you got to look him up. But anyway, just giving you a shout, Eric, if you're listening. But I have one last question, and that is, what advice would you give to aspiring entrepreneurs in general, and also in particular to those here in Guatemala?
Just don't give up. I mean, it seems impossible, and even culturally, we're biased in Latin America to not have a high tolerance for failure. Just ignore those signals, and if you truly are passionate about what you're doing and good at it, because the two have to go together, go for it. See what doors you can knock on. Here's our door, and we can open many other doors for people like that. And just know that if you do, devote yourself to an endeavor, to creating value out of an idea, to creating a product out of nothing, and allocating resources that way, it's really a positive sum game. It's not a zero sum game. It's not a trade where somebody wins and somebody loses. The founder is winning. Society in general is winning. People who invested in the founder are winning. So I think there's not much more noble uses for finance or where to devote your life than being a founder. So go for it if you have the talent, the idea, and the passion for it.
That's great. And one add-on to that is, what would it take if somebody was starting a startup here in Guatemala? What would it take for them to gain your interest in Invariantes, possibly investing in them?
Got it. And it's maybe a generic answer,
right?
But every fund has their own formula. But you divide it mostly into 4 buckets if they're attacking a massive market. Because again, every investment has to be a potential fund returner, and if you're not attacking a massive market, your sales are not going to grow to the scale that you need for that multiple on sales to be such that you can go from a valuation at the initial stages all the way to an exit, and that investment could be a fund returner without getting into the math, but right. I hope that makes sense. Have your own team in-house developing every part of the solution, and have the chops, and also be able to communicate it eloquently, because you're going to have to, again, to sell to investors, to sell to clients, and to the talent that you want to recruit. Have a clear understanding of the unit economics, how you plan to make money, and finally have a valuation that's realistic. Yeah, and be ethical as well. We've seen more than our share of companies that go down not because of a lack of a good product, but because misuse of resources for personal effects or straight up manufacturing of sales. Honesty is also one of the qualities that we look for. Impossible to test, but you kind of get a sense of all those 4, and if you check those check boxes, there's a good chance that we end up investing.
That's great. Well, that's great advice. Probably some stuff you learned at UFM too. But they always talk about ethics, right? Not just the market economics and all that, but but the ethics and the paying attention to that. Well, Fernando, I just want to say thank you for being an agent of innovation here in Guatemala and for being on the Agents of Innovation podcast. For those listening and watching, we're on YouTube, Apple, Spotify. I always ask if people can subscribe to the podcast, share it, like it, comment. Actually, comment right now, whatever platform you're listening to this on, because we'd love to hear what you thought of this interview. And really appreciate everybody listening. And thank you, Fernando, for your time today.
No, thank you for becoming almost an ambassador for Guatemala and for having me. And, our doors are open to you and to your listeners.
Great. Thank you.